All right, in this video, I'm going to show you how to solve a polynomial by factoring. So if you're not good at factoring, you need to go back and watch the other videos on solving by factoring because there's different methods I'll use to factor in here that they've been reviewed before. So you need to know how to factor before you jump into these videos. So my first one, we're going to find the zeros of the function. So that is also solving by factoring. So what we have is instead of f of x there, that's as good as having a 0 x to the fourth plus x cubed minus 12x squared. Now when I factor, the first thing I look for is there a GCF? So is there something I could take out of all three of these terms? So I have an x to the fourth, x to the third, and a negative 12x squared. If you notice, they all have at least an x squared in common. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out the GCF of x squared. So it leaves me an x squared. I'm going to have x squared plus x minus 12 left over. And this is still equal to 0. Next step from there is I would like to factor what's inside this parentheses. So x squared plus x minus 12. So this is where you would need to think back to all your factoring methods. So what I'm looking for is two numbers that multiply to negative 12 but add to, and that is a 1 in front of there. So two numbers that multiply to negative 12 but add to 1. Those numbers are going to be positive 4 and negative 3. So I'm going to have an x plus 4 and x minus 3. I still have my GCF there, which is an x squared. So I have 0 equals x squared, x plus 4, x minus 3. So this is completely factored. Once it's factored, if you ever want to find the zeros of something, you're going to take every single factor, set it equal to 0, and solve. So one of my factors is x squared, so I'm going to have x squared is equal to 0. One of my factors is x plus 4, so x plus 4 is equal to 0. And x minus 3 is equal to 0. So I need to solve each of these to figure out my zeros. So if I have x squared equals 0, since I have x all alone in a square there, you could take the square root of both sides. And you get x equals 0, so that's one of my zeros. If I have x plus 4 is equal to 0, I subtract 4 from both sides. And you get x equals negative 4. And then my third piece, x minus 3, set that equal to 0 and solve. You get x equals 3 when you add 3 to both sides. So that was one example of finding zeros of a function and solving a polynomial by factoring. I'm going to show you one more. So I have g of x equals x to the fourth minus 8x squared plus 16. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in 0 because we are finding these zeros of this function. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor this. So looking at it, I look for a GCF with all my terms. There is none on this one. But this, oddly enough, kind of looks very familiar to these forms of problems. This had an x squared plus x minus 12. So we look for two numbers that multiply to the back and add to the middle. This one can be done in relatively the same way. The only difference is notice how we have higher powers here. We have x to the fourth and x squared. So we doubled both of those powers. You'll see where that all comes in here in a second. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look for two numbers that multiply to 16 but add to negative 8. Those numbers are going to be negative 4 and negative 4. The only difference here, though, is last time when we had just an x squared and an x, you just got plain old x's there. Down here, what we're going to have is we're going to have an x squared and an x squared. If I wanted to multiply all of that out, I would get this exact same piece here. So that's how you would kind of check to see if you're right if you're unsure. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these and see if I can factor these. So x squared minus 4. So this is one of those that you're looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 4, but notice how we have no middle piece there. So multiply to negative 4 or and add to 0. So two numbers that multiply to negative 4 and add to 0, that is plus 2 and minus 2. So I have 0 equals x plus 2 and x minus 2. Over here I have x squared minus 4, so two numbers that multiply to negative 4, add to the middle, which is 0. That is also plus 2 and minus 2. So I now have it completely factored. So just like before, once you have it completely factored, you're going to take each of your factors, set them equal to 0, and solve. So I'm going to have x plus 2 is equal to 0, x minus 2 is equal to 0, x plus 2 is equal to 0, and x minus 2 is equal to 0. And then you go through and you want to solve each of these. So solving this one, subtract 2 from both sides, we get x equals negative 2. Here you would get x equals 2. Here you would get x equals negative 2. Notice how we got that again. That's going to be important a little bit further down the road. Then I have x minus 2 is equal to 0. Solve that, you get x equals 2. So I have positive 2 show up twice, and I have negative 2 show up twice. So that would be finding the zeros of this function. Before I go, one more thing I want to mention is when you have it completely factored out like this, notice how we have x plus 2 show up twice. You might see this same problem written out. Since it shows up twice, you can write x plus 2 squared. And notice how x minus 2 shows up twice. So you can have x minus 2 squared. So these are both the same. You can have it completely broken down like that, but since x plus 2 shows up twice, you could do x plus 2 squared. X minus 2 shows up twice, you could do x minus 2 squared. That is finding the zeros of a function and solving a polynomial by factoring.